The interstellar Scholastic Institute orbited a perfectly pleasant Class M moon, which itself orbited a perfectly pleasant gas giant, which itself orbited a perfectly pleasant star that had never once in its 10 billion years of existence produced a solar flare strong enough to inconvenience anyone. This was, according to the 847 species that attended the institute, exactly how educational facilities should be located. Safe, predictable, boring enough that students might actually focus on learning instead of survival. The institute prided itself on being the premier academic establishment in the Orion Arm, possibly in the entire galaxy, though the Andromeda delegation always got snippy when anyone suggested this. For 3,000 years, it had produced the finest minds in theoretical physics, quantum mathematics, and advanced xenobiology. The architecture alone was worth 6 dissertations. Crystalline spires that shifted through dimensions, libraries that existed in folded spacetime, and dormitories that somehow provided species-appropriate atmosphere, gravity, and humidity without anyone quite understanding how. The student body represented the cream of civilized space, and civilized was doing some heavy lifting in that sentence, because it specifically meant species who had evolved on worlds where the most dangerous predator was maybe a fruit that fermented a bit too enthusiastically, or perhaps a weather pattern that occasionally became mildly inconvenient. Species who had developed technology, philosophy, and art in environments that could best be described as aggressively pleasant. Nobody had ever exploded at sea level on any of their worlds. That was important. It came up in the admission requirements. Vexthor was exactly the sort of student the Institute loved, a Kryllian from the crystalline gardens of Prism 4. His body was a magnificent lattice of silicon-based structures that refracted light into educational patterns when he was thinking particularly hard thoughts. His species had evolved in caves of singing crystal, where the most stressful event in their evolution had been deciding which mineral deposit to photosynthesize from. They had developed mathematics because they were bored. They had developed philosophy because mathematics got boring. They had developed faster than light travel because sitting around being philosophical was also, eventually, boring. Vexthor stood, metaphorically speaking, at the top of his class. Literally speaking, he stood about 4 feet tall and looked like someone had convinced a chandelier to attend university. He had published 3 papers before his graduation equivalency, solved 2 outstanding problems in quantum chromodynamics, and had an ego that could be seen from orbit without magnification, which made the announcement particularly devastating. The Terran admission protocols had been argued about for the better part of a decade. Earth, Terra, that bizarre little mudball in an unfashionable corner of the galaxy, had applied for membership in the galactic academic community. The debate had been vicious. Earth was, according to every metric that mattered, a Class 1-2 Deathworld. Not the worst. Not even in the top 10. But bad enough that most species travel insurance policies included a "if you're stupid enough to go there, you're on your own" clause. The gravity alone would crush a Quilnathi. The oxygen concentration would poison a Vex. The native predators included creatures that hunted for sport, plants that actively tried to kill you, and weather patterns that seemed to have personal vendettas. Earth had more ways to kill you than most worlds had species. It had mass extinction events the way other planets had seasons. And now, somehow, they had been admitted. The reasoning, according to the Council of Academic Oversight, was that humanity had demonstrated sufficient technological advancement, cultural sophistication, and, most importantly, had stopped trying to kill each other long enough to fill out the application forms correctly. 3 times. After the first 2 were rejected for bloodstains. Vexthor thought it was a joke, a publicity stunt. Surely they would not actually send anyone. Humans were rumored to be semi-functional, yes, but they were Deathworlders. Primitive, violent. They probably could not even handle the rigorous academic environment without trying to establish a dominance hierarchy or whatever it was Deathworlders did. Then Jade Chen walked into advanced theoretical physics, and every assumption in the room shattered like Vexthor's ego was about to. She looked wrong. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Humans were bipedal, which was common enough, but they moved wrong. Too smooth, too efficient. Like every motion was calculated for maximum threat potential, even when she was just walking to a desk. She was small by Deathworld standards, apparently, standing only about 1.7 meters tall. Her skin was that strange not quite brown that humans came in, and her hair was dark and pulled back in a configuration that probably had a function nobody wanted to ask about. She wore the standard institute uniform, which had been specially modified to accommodate her biology. The modifications included reinforced gravity compensation, because apparently humans were used to 10 meters per second squared and found the institute's comfortable 6.5 to be a bit floaty. The oxygen mix had to be adjusted in her personal atmosphere field. The temperature was set to something that would have been considered approaching dangerous for most species. She smiled at the class. Several students flinched. Professor Quillnax, a distinguished Quillnathi, whose 17 tendrils were each decorated with academic honors, rippled in what might have been concern or possibly indigestion. The Quillnathi did not have faces, so it was hard to tell. Class, please welcome our new student from Earth. She comes to us with impressive credentials, including top marks from the Terran Science Academy and several commendations for The professor's translation implant hiccuped slightly. Survival training? That seems like an odd thing to have on an academic transcript. Jade's smile widened, showing teeth. Everyone flinched again. It is required curriculum on Earth, Professor. Along with emergency medicine, disaster response, and hostile environment adaptation. How wonderfully paranoid, Quillnax rippled. Please, take a seat. We were just discussing the theoretical implications of quantum entanglement in non-Euclidean spacetime. She's Saturday. The chair groaned slightly under her Deathworld bone density. Vexthor watched this with growing irritation. The crystalline structure of his thought lattice was generating increasingly sharp patterns. This was ridiculous. This was his class. He had been here for 4 standard cycles. He had earned his position through brilliance and dedication. And now they were just going to let a Deathworlder walk in and sit down like she belonged. The lecture continued. Quillnax was discussing the finer points of quantum probability fields, a subject that Vex's Thor had mastered in his second cycle. He was barely paying attention, instead watching the human take notes. She wrote by hand, with an actual stylus on an actual tablet, like some kind of primitive. Most students just recorded everything directly to their neural interfaces, or memory crystals, or psychic impression journals. Then Quillnax asked a question, a complex one, involving multidimensional tensor calculus and the behavior of entangled particles in gravitational shear. Vexthor's lattice lit up immediately. He knew this. He had literally written a paper on this. His structure began refracting light in a pattern that indicated he was about to speak, the crystalline equivalent of raising a hand. The human spoke first. The entanglement would persist through the shear, but the quantum information transfer would be delayed by the gravitational gradient, creating a temporal displacement proportional to the mass differential. You would effectively have quantum information arriving before it was sent from a localized reference frame, but causality would be preserved in the universal frame. It is similar to the way time dilation affects communication in strong gravitational fields. The class went silent. Quillnax rippled in what was definitely surprise. That is correct. Very concisely stated. Have you studied this material before? No, Professor. It just seemed logical. It just seemed logical. Vexthor's entire lattice structure nearly inverted. That was graduate-level material. That required understanding of at least 6 different theoretical frameworks. That was not something you just reasoned out because it seemed logical. Impressive, Quillnax continued. Though I would be curious to see your mathematical proof. I can show you after class, Jade offered. I think better with a whiteboard anyway. Several students exchanged glances. The ones who had translation difficulties looked confused. A whiteboard? What manner of primitive technology was that? Vexthor had heard enough. His pride, already wounded by her casual display of competence, demanded action. He modulated his vocal resonance to carry across the classroom. Perhaps our new classmate would be interested in a more practical demonstration of understanding. Theory is one thing, application is another. Jade turned to look at him. Her eyes, which were an unsettling brown with white surrounds and black centers, focused with an intensity that made his outer layer want to refract defensively. What did you have in mind? A challenge, Vexthor said, warming to the idea. Academic, of course. A practical application of theoretical principles. unless you are not confident in your abilities. There was a collective intake of various breathing mediums around the classroom. Several students began quietly moving toward the exits. The Quillnathi, who sat next to Jade, actually teleported 3 desks away. Professor Quillnax rippled in what was definitely concern now. Vexthor, I am not certain that is appropriate for classroom. I accept, Jade said calmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Or maybe that was just everyone's circulatory equivalents freezing in horror. Wonderful, Vexthor said, trying to ignore the small voice in his thought lattice that was screaming about Deathworld predators and survival instincts. Shall we say 3 rounds? Theoretical problem solving, practical application, and a final challenge of the winner's choosing? Sure, Jade said, in the same tone most species would use to agree to lunch plans. Do you want to start now, or should we make this interesting? Now is fine, Vexthor said, absolutely certain he was about to put this Deathworlder in her place. Narrator's note, he was not. Professor Quillnax, recognizing that stopping this would require more authority than any professor actually possessed when student egos were involved, rippled in resignation and moved to the primary display panel. Very well. Since you both seem determined to turn my classroom into a gladiatorial arena of intellect, let us at least make it educational. Round 1. Theoretical problem solving. The professor's tendrils danced across the holographic interface, pulling up a problem that made several students whimper in dismay. It was a nightmare of quantum mathematics, involving the theoretical stabilization of a wormhole using negative energy states and exotic matter configurations. The kind of problem that showed up on advanced doctoral exams, usually right before students had emotional breakdowns. You will each present a solution methodology. Quillnax rippled. Vexthor, as you initiated this challenge, you may proceed first. Vexthor's lattice structure began glowing with intense concentration. This was his element. Pure theory, crystalline logic, mathematical elegance. His species had been solving problems like this for entertainment since before humans had discovered fire. Probably, he approached the display and began constructing his solution. Equations flowed in 3-dimensional holographic space, each variable perfectly placed, each calculation precisely executed. He walked through the quantum mechanics, explained the energy requirements, detailed the mathematical framework for maintaining wormhole stability. It was textbook perfect. It was exactly the kind of solution that had earned him his reputation. It took him 20 minutes. When he finished, his lattice was glowing with satisfaction. Several students rippled or vibrated or luminesced their approval. Jade stood up and walked to the display. She stared at the problem for approximately 30 seconds. Then she wiped Vexthor's entire solution and started drawing. What emerged was not elegant. It was not textbook. It looked like someone had let chaos have a degree in physics, and then given it access to mathematics. She approached the problem from an angle that made several theoretical physicists in the room question their life choices. Instead of trying to stabilize the wormhole through careful energy management, she proposed deliberately destabilizing it in precisely controlled oscillations, using the instability itself as the stabilizing force. It was insane. It violated at least 3 principles of conservative energy management. It required calculations that had to be performed in real time with no margin for error. It would probably explode if you sneezed near it. It would also work, and it would work using about 60% of the energy Vexthor's solution required. Professor Quillnax's tendrils hung in stunned silence for a long moment. That is completely unorthodox. But it works, Jade said. I mean, I would not want to be anywhere near it when you turned it on, but it works. You would not want to be near your own solution, one student asked in horror. Well, not without shielding, Jade said reasonably. The oscillations would produce some nasty radiation spikes. But that is true for any wormhole generator. At least this one tells you when it is about to fail catastrophically. How comforting, Quillnax rippled dryly. Round 1 appears to be a draw. Both solutions are theoretically sound, if one of them is significantly more terrifying than the other. Shall we proceed to practical application? The class moved to the Institute's physics laboratory, which was less a room and more a pocket dimension, specifically designed to contain experiments that might accidentally threaten local spacetime. Safety fields hummed at frequencies that made sensitive species uncomfortable. The walls were lined with equipment that looked expensive and fragile. Professor Quilnax generated a controlled artificial gravity well in the center of the lab, deliberately unstable. Your task is to stabilize this. You may use any of the available equipment. Try not to create any singularities. The paperwork is terrible. Vex Thor approached the problem with his characteristic precision. He selected instruments carefully, ran preliminary scans, and began making minute adjustments to the gravity well's parameters. His approach was methodical, calculated, safe. Each change was carefully measured. Each variable was monitored. It was taking time, but it was working. Jade, meanwhile, had walked directly up to the gravity well's containment field and stuck her hand through it. Every alarm in the laboratory went off simultaneously. "What are you doing?" Quilnax shrieked, all 17 tendrils standing straight out in panic. "Checking the resonance frequency," Jade said calmly, her hand still inside a gravity field that should have been crushing her bones into powder. "The sensors are not giving accurate readings because they are outside the field. You need to measure from inside. That should be liquefying. Your arm." "Oh, it is pretty uncomfortable," Jade admitted, "but humans have this neat trick where we can tense our muscles against pressure differentials. We evolved diving underwater to hunt things that did not want to be hunted. This is only about 3 atmospheres of equivalent pressure. I can handle that for a minute or two." She pulled her hand out, made some rapid calculations on her tablet, and then began adjusting the containment field's parameters from memory. No careful measurements, no preliminary scans, just raw empirical data and apparently a complete disregard for safety protocols. The gravity well stabilized in 4 minutes. Vex Thor's lattice structure had stopped glowing entirely. He was still carefully adjusting his parameters, not even halfway through his procedure, when Jade stepped back and declared herself finished. "How did you do that?" he finally asked, his vocal resonance cracking slightly. "Trial and error," Jade said with a shrug. "Well, mostly trial. The error would have been bad. You could have died." "Probably not," she said thoughtfully. "I mean, worst case. I lose an arm, but we have pretty good medical technology. I would be fine in a few months." The casual way she said this made several species question whether they had properly understood human medical technology or human attitude toward their own appendages. Professor Quilnax rippled weakly. "Round 2 goes to the human. I am going to need to file an incident report and possibly reconsider my career choices." "Vex Thor, you mentioned a final challenge?" This was it. Vex Thor's last chance to salvage his dignity and prove that Deathworlders, no matter how competent they appeared, were still fundamentally inferior to proper civilized species. He needed something that would expose the human's primitive nature, her lack of true academic rigor, his thought lattice crystallized around a terrible idea. "Emergency scenario simulation," he said. "The Institute has training programs for catastrophic system failures. We solve them theoretically, demonstrating our ability to remain calm and logical under pressure." Jade's expression shifted slightly. If Vex Thor had been better at reading human facial configurations, he might have recognized it as concern. "You sure about that? Are you concerned you cannot handle it?" Vex Thor said, letting his wounded pride overrule the increasingly loud warnings in his thought lattice. "More concerned that you cannot," Jade said quietly. "These simulations are designed to feel real. If you are not used to actual emergencies, I am quite capable of handling a simulation," Vex Thor interrupted. "Unless you are attempting to make excuses before we even begin." Jade sighed. "All right. Your funeral. Metaphorically speaking. The simulation chamber was designed to be the perfect training environment. It could replicate any crisis scenario with complete sensory fidelity, from shipboard disasters to planetary evacuations. The key word being replicate. It was not real. It was completely safe. The worst thing that could happen was emotional distress, and maybe some mild psychological trauma. For a proper civilized species, this was adequate preparation for emergencies that would, in all likelihood, never occur. For a human, this was apparently somewhere between boring and Tuesday. Professor Quilnax loaded a scenario that was considered one of the more challenging ones. Complete shipboard system failure during a gravity well transition, with multiple cascading emergencies requiring immediate theoretical solutions to prevent catastrophic loss of life. It was the kind of scenario that usually resulted in students freezing up, panicking, or requiring counseling afterward. The simulation began. Vexthor immediately found himself in a ship's bridge that was, to put it mildly, having a bad day. Alarms were screaming. Holographic displays were flashing red. The artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. Somewhere in the distance, something was definitely exploding. The sensory inputs were completely overwhelming, designed to test a student's ability to maintain logical thinking under stress. His thought lattice locked up almost immediately. This was too much, too loud, too chaotic. His species had evolved in peaceful crystal caves. The most stressful situation they had ever faced evolutionarily was a mineral shortage. His entire cognitive structure was not designed for this kind of stimulus. He was dimly aware of theoretical solutions existing. He knew there were logical steps to take, but his consciousness was too busy screaming in crystalline harmonics to actually implement any of them. Then Jade moved, and Vexthor learned what terrifying competence actually meant. She did not freeze. She did not panic. She immediately began moving through the simulated bridge, with the kind of purposeful intensity that suggested she had done this before. Multiple times, possibly for fun. Main power coupling is compromised. Gravity generator is in cascade failure. Life support is running on backup, she said, her voice suddenly clipped and professional. Stabilizing gravity first, then power, then life support. Environmental can run on reduced for 5 minutes without casualties. She was at a control panel that was sparking, because the simulation had a dark sense of drama. Her hands moved across the interface with practiced precision, while she simultaneously called out commands that suggested she expected other people to be there helping her. The gravity stabilized. Vexthor stopped floating uncontrollably and hit the deck with a thud that his lattice structure would complain about later. Power coupling needs a manual reset, Jade announced. Environmental controls, 2 decks down, section 7. Shortest route is through the compromise section. She left the bridge at a run. Vexthor, still trying to process what was happening, watched through the simulation's omniscient observation mode as Jade navigated through corridors that were venting atmosphere, past fires that should not exist in space but did anyway because simulations were dramatic, and into an environmental control room that was filled with toxic gas. She held her breath. Just held her breath, and worked. Humans, it turned out, could hold their breath for several minutes if properly motivated. The simulation apparently had not accounted for this, because it kept helpfully suggesting she use the emergency respirator. She ignored it, finished rerouting the power coupling, and made it back to breathable atmosphere with approximately 15 seconds to spare. The life support systems came back online. The simulation registered this as the crisis being averted. Jade returned to the bridge, slightly out of breath, but otherwise completely fine. That was easier than most, she said conversationally. The environmental controls were clearly labeled. Usually you have to figure out which alien species designed the ship first. Vexthor's thought lattice made a sound like breaking glass. Usually, we run disaster drills pretty regularly on Earth, Jade explained. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, solar flares, ecological collapse scenarios. You know, the usual stuff. That is not usual, someone shouted from the observation area. Also, they make us do survival training in school, Jade continued. I did mine in the Australian outback. That is a desert where everything is trying to kill you and the sun is trying to kill you and sometimes the ground is trying to kill you. This simulation was just a spaceship having a bad day. Spaceships are easy. They only have like 3 or 4 ways to kill you at once. Professor Quillnax rippled in a way that suggested several of his tendrils were considering early retirement. You did this for education? Well, yeah. I mean, Earth is pretty dangerous. You have to learn to handle emergencies early. By the time we are teenagers, most of us have basic emergency medical training, disaster response protocols, and at least 1 or 2 survival certifications. It is just practical. The word practical hung in the air like an accusation against every other species' definition of education. Vexthor finally managed to reboot his thought lattice enough to speak. You were in actual danger in that simulation. Multiple times. And you just proceeded as if it were normal. It was a simulation, Jade pointed out. Nothing was actually dangerous. If this had been real, I would have been way more careful. More careful than running through toxic gas while holding your breath. Well, yeah. I would have checked to make sure there was not anything worse than toxic gas first. Could have been corrosive. Or radioactive. You have to assess the threat level before you commit. The fact that she had a threat assessment protocol for different types of atmospheric hazards said everything about human education that needed to be said. Vexthor's entire worldview was reconstructing itself in real time. For his entire life, he had operated under the assumption that intelligence was the product of peaceful, logical societies. That brilliance came from environments where one could sit and think without being interrupted by threats to one's existence. That civilization was built by species who had transcended survival and could focus on higher pursuits. Earth suggested something different. Earth suggested that intelligence was just another survival trait, and humans had sharpened it against threats that would have wiped out any other species. They had learned to think under pressure because pressure was the only environment they had ever known. They solved problems quickly because slow solutions meant death, and they considered this normal. I believe, Vexthor said slowly, his vocal resonance subdued, that you have won the challenge. I appreciate that, Jade said, but I am not sure it was fair. You challenged me to things that play to my species' strengths. On your world, I would probably be completely hopeless. I bet you can do things with crystal harmonics that I cannot even perceive, let alone replicate. This was gracious. This was sporting. This was absolutely not making Vexthor feel any better about his humiliation. Professor Quillnax rippled, with what might have been relief that nobody had died, even theoretically. I believe we have all learned valuable lessons today about hubris, different forms of intelligence, and why we have safety protocols that people should actually follow. The class filtered back into the main lecture hall, most students maintaining a respectful distance from Jade, who seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she had just traumatized an entire classroom. Vexthor approached her carefully, his lattice structure dim with embarrassment. I apologize for my behavior. I allowed pride to cloud my judgment. No worries, Jade said cheerfully. I get it. New student, different species, you wanted to establish academic credentials. Totally normal. Though maybe next time, lead with questions instead of challenges? I am actually here to learn, not just to freak everyone out with Deathworld nonsense. Is it all nonsense? Vexthor asked. The stories about Earth? Oh no, most of it is completely accurate, Jade said. Earth is terrifying. We have apex predators that hunt in packs, weather systems that can level cities, tectonic activity that regularly reshapes continents, and like 6 different ways the sun can kill you if you are outside too long. But it is home, you know? You adapt. You adapt to being constantly under threat of death? I mean, you adapt to whatever environment you are in, Jade said with a shrug. Your world adapted to crystal caves and mineral processing. Mine adapted to everything trying to eat us. Different solutions to different problems. This was probably the most philosophically sound thing anyone had said in the classroom all day, which was ironic considering it came from the species everyone had assumed was primitive. Over the following weeks, an interesting dynamic developed in advanced theoretical physics. Vexthor, his ego sufficiently adjusted, began actually talking to Jade rather than at her. He discovered that she was, in fact, brilliant, but in ways that his species' education had not prepared him to recognize. She approached problems from angles that seemed insane until they worked. She had intuitions about physical systems that came from living in a world where understanding physics was a survival requirement. In return, Jade learned to appreciate the elegant, methodical approaches favored by species who had the luxury of thinking slowly and carefully. Vexthor's solutions might take longer, but they were beautiful in their precision. His mathematical proofs were works of art. They became, improbably, study partners. Then, even more improbably, friends. The rest of the class adapted as well. Once everyone got over their initial terror, they realized that having a human in class was actually advantageous. Jade had practical experience with emergencies that made theoretical discussions much more grounded. She could point out which elegant solutions would work in practice and which would get you killed when the power failed at the worst possible moment. She also, it turned out, was very good at explaining complex concepts. Something about surviving on Earth had given her an ability to break down complicated ideas into their essential components very quickly. When you needed to understand physics to avoid dying, you got efficient at learning. Professor Quilnax, after recovering from the stress of the challenge incident, admitted privately that having a Deathworlder in class had improved the overall education of everyone involved. Nothing like a human pointing out the practical flaws in your elegant theory to keep you honest. Jade's presence did create some interesting cultural exchanges. She introduced the concept of stress eating to species who had never experienced stress in any form worth eating about. She tried to explain human recreational activities like skydiving and rock climbing to students who could not fathom risking death for fun. She showed them pictures of Earth, and several students needed counseling after seeing what humans considered beautiful landscapes. Vexthor, for his part, learned to stop assuming that different meant inferior. Earth was horrible by any reasonable metric, yes, but it had produced a species that was adaptable, resilient, and apparently unkillable through conventional means. Humans might never have his species' crystalline logic, but they had something equally valuable: the ability to function when everything was on fire and the plan had failed 3 disasters ago. The semester continued. Challenges were issued, though none as dramatic as that first one. Solutions were found. Friendships were formed. Academic papers were written, several of them co-authored by a Krillian and a human, combining elegant theory with practical application in ways that made senior professors very excited about the future of xenophysics. And if the Institute quietly updated its admission protocols to include more Deathworld species after seeing what Jade could do, well, that was probably overdue anyway. The galaxy was a big place, and it turned out that civilization came in more forms than anyone had previously assumed. On a peaceful space station, orbiting a peaceful moon, circling a peaceful planet, under a peaceful star that had never done anything interesting, the most interesting thing to happen in 3,000 years continued happening every day. Students from hundreds of worlds learned from each other, challenged each other, and occasionally terrified each other in the name of education. Vexthor stood in the laboratory, watching Jade casually stick her hand into another gravity field because she insisted the sensors were calibrated wrong again, and reflected on how far he had come from the arrogant student who had challenged her that first day. He had learned the most important lesson that any academic could learn, and it had come from the last species he expected. Intelligence was not about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions, staying curious, and recognizing that brilliance came in many forms. Even if some of those forms were absolutely terrifying and had no sense of self-preservation. Jade, he called out, his lattice structure refracting light in concern. That field is rated at 7 atmospheres equivalent. Yeah, I know, she called back. I can handle 9 for short periods. This is fine. That is not remotely fine by any definition. Agree to disagree, she said cheerfully. Vexthor rippled in exasperation and went to get the medical kit. Again, Professor Quilnax had started keeping one specifically labeled for human incidents in the laboratory. It was used weekly. Some things, he had learned, you just had to accept. And if one of those things was that your study partner was from a death world and had the survival instincts of someone actively seeking to void their life insurance, well, at least it was never boring. The Interstellar Scholastic Institute had stood for 3,000 years as a beacon of civilized learning. It would stand for 3,000 more, probably, barring accidents. And it would be better for having learned that civilization was not defined by how safe your world was, but by what you did with the intelligence you developed regardless. Even if that intelligence occasionally expressed itself by sticking hands into gravity fields and running through toxic atmospheres, because the sensors might be wrong, and you really needed to check manually. Vexthor's lattice structure finally achieved something it had been working toward for weeks, a pattern that expressed genuine affection mixed with profound exasperation. It was the crystalline equivalent of a long-suffering sigh. Jade, he said, would you please get your hand out of the gravity field before you dislocate something? Just a second, she said, I am almost done calibrating. You know there are tools for that, correct? Yeah, But this is faster. And that, Vexthor reflected, was humanity in a nutshell. Why use tools when you could use yourself? Why solve problems safely when you could solve them quickly? Why avoid danger when you could just become more dangerous than whatever was threatening you? The galaxy had been very peaceful before humans arrived. It was still peaceful, technically. But it was a much more interesting kind of peaceful now. Jade pulled her hand out of the gravity field, grinning. See, perfectly fine. The sensor was off by 0.3%, by the way. Whoever calibrated this last did a sloppy job. That was me, Vexthor said dryly. I calibrated it yesterday. Oh, Jade said. Well, then whoever built the sensor did a sloppy job. That was also me. It was my engineering project last semester. Ah. Jade had the grace to look slightly apologetic. I am sure it is fine for most purposes. Just not for the kind of precision measurements we need for the quantum entanglement experiment. And you determined this by risking your appendage. I determined this by using empirical observation, Jade corrected. My appendage was never at risk. Well, not serious risk. I have 2 hands. I can spare one, if the science requires it. Vexthor's lattice made the sound of breaking glass again. Humans are insane. Humans are practical, Jade countered. There is a difference. Not from where I am standing. Then maybe you are standing in the wrong place, Jade said with a grin. Come on. We have got that paper to finish on quantum coherence in high-gravity environments, and I have some ideas about the experimental setup that you are absolutely going to hate. Why would I hate them? Because they involve deliberately destabilizing things that should not be destabilized, running calculations in real time with no safety margins, and probably setting off every alarm in the building. That is not science. That is a cry for help. That is how you get results that matter, Jade said. Safe science is slow science. Slow science does not win academic prizes. Slow science also does not require filling out incident reports. Well, you can't have everything, Jade said philosophically. And really, Vexthor thought as he followed her to their study area, that summed up his entire educational experience since meeting her. You could not have everything. But if you were willing to occasionally risk incident reports, psychological trauma, and the fundamental reorganization of your worldview, you could have something better than everything. You could have an education that actually prepared you for a universe that was not always safe, predictable, or boring. Even if that education came with a side of terror and the constant question of whether your study partner was going to lose a limb in pursuit of accurate data. The Interstellar Scholastic Institute continued its peaceful orbit. Students continued their studies. Papers were written, discoveries were made, and academic reputations were built and occasionally shattered. And somewhere in a laboratory, a Krillian and a human were about to do something that would either revolutionize quantum physics or require evacuation of an entire wing of the facility. Probably both. Such was the nature of progress in the new era of galactic education. Brilliant, terrifying, and absolutely worth the incident reports.